Hi, I'm Laura Flanders, and this is City Works, a co-production of the School of Labor and Urban Studies of the City University of New York and CUNY TV. Our program explores the lived experience of working people in New York and other urban areas. And today I am very pleased to offer this Reporters Roundtable on how labor and working people and people who'd like to be working or like to be working less fared last elections and what to expect next. To tackle the task, I am joined by four outstanding journalists. Michelle Chen is a contributing writer for both The Nation and In These Times. She's a contributing editor at Dissent magazine and co-produces and co-hosts two podcasts, Asia Pacific Forum and Dissent's wonderful Belabored. Jeet Hare serves as national affairs correspondent for The Nation magazine and is the former senior editor at The New Republic. And Harold Meyerson, well, Harold has been an editor of the American Prospect for 20 years. He was also an op-ed columnist at the Washington Post from 2003 to 2015 and is no stranger to these roundtables. Juan Manuel Benitez is anchor and reporter for Spectrum News, New York Channel 1, and the host of Pura Politica, the current affairs program of NY1 Noticias. He's a frequent guest host on the Brian Laura Show, too. That's on Public Radio's WNYC in New York. So where do we begin? We could begin in lots of different places, but let's begin with what we think actually happened. There has been a lot of talk about incremental shifts in percentages of demographic votes for different candidates. In particular, a lot of media attention to the incremental increase in the vote count for the Republican candidate, Donald Trump, from various demographic groups who we are all surprised might have voted for Trump. But the big story surely is the epic turnout that we saw this election, such that President-elect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris seem to have won a historic vote haul, some 76, I think, million votes, making it a history-breaking, record-breaking election by all accounts. Let's start with you, Harold. Your top takeaway from just the results so far.
Well, first, just a sigh of relief that Joe Biden won, and I do not think that the Trump people will be able to obstruct that, try though they may. I think that the 4 years of Donald Trump was guaranteed to increase turnout. And I think when all the votes are counted, and my native state of California always comes in last in terms of doing that, the Biden-Harris ticket will have a popular vote edge over Donald Trump of 5.5, perhaps even 6 million votes. So that's substantial. But you have to give Trump and the Republicans credit. They turned over rocks in order to find people who don't usually vote, who were mobilized, I won't say by the Trump message, since the message was kind of unclear, but by the Trump ethos of disdain for a lot of the changes going on in the country towards racial and gender equality, the rise of secularism, and so on. And that leaves us with a somewhat confounding situation.
All right, Juan Manuel, I have to get to you about that Latinx vote. I mean, extraordinary shift there, huge demographic group really making itself felt this election.
That's right, Laura. And I think we need to be really careful because we tell the same story. Every 4 years, we have to remind Americans that the Latino vote is not monolithic, and that is not like, we cannot talk about the Latino vote the same way that we talk about the white vote and the Black vote. So we have an extremely complex Latinx community all over the country that is extremely different in every single different state where it is right now. Now, the results that we have, the data that we have, for the most part, is polling data. We know that before the election, most of the polling was wrong. So I would be extremely careful with reading too much into the exit polling data that we have right now about the Latino community. In some states, like New York State, we're still counting the votes. We are still counting mail-in ballots. So before we make big statements about Latinx people in this country going massively for Donald Trump, we need to be extremely careful. And it doesn't look like the Latinx vote that Donald Trump got is higher than the share that George W. Bush got in 2004. So there's still a lot of work for Republicans to do if they want to increase their share of the Latino vote in this country.
Coming to you, Michelle. I mean, there's an awful lot of categories that a lot of people that fall into that category other. And in this election, more than ever, that other needs to be investigated. The Native American vote, Asian vote in lots of places got counted in other. And then, of course, this question of women, a category that has always been misleading. White women haven't voted majority for a Republican for decades, and yet every election it seems to be breaking news. It's breaking news. 55% of us, apparently, more than last time, a bigger proportion than last time, voted for Trump. White women, that is. We'll talk more about that, but your takeaways from the results so far as you know them, Michelle.
Yeah, I guess one of the main takeaways might be don't trust the polls. But in many ways, I think some of the conventional wisdom, or at least the new conventional wisdom post 2016, has been sort of overturned yet again. And I think that our work as journalists continues to be somewhat complicated by these election cycles. And I also think that we did see record turnout from a number of those groups, including groups of historically marginalized communities. But we also see that there has been record turnout for Trump, right? So this might signal to Democrats that the supposition that higher turnout automatically benefits the Democrats is not necessarily true, right? Then again, it's not like the GOP is really picking up on the power of increased voter turnout, because they seem to be doing their best to suppress as many votes as possible, but and also suppressing not just voters, but actual votes, given that they continue to litigate this process and try to undermine the counting of actual ballots. But yeah, I do think that in terms of the turnout of white women, again, for Trump, in the months leading up to the election, there was a narrative going around that Trump was losing suburban women, right? To the extent that Trump himself from the podium was sort of desperately reaching out to suburban women and pleading for them to vote for him because he would put their husbands back to work. And I guess it seems like a lot of maybe a lot of wasted energy trying to read the tea leaves based on conclusions that didn't really turn out to that didn't really materialize. And I still do think that after 2016, there was kind of a lot of soul searching going on with people deciding sort of, what the hell is wrong with white women and how should we reach out to them. And I still think that there's still some work to be done there in terms of, I think there are whole swaths of this country that people don't understand. And even activists that generally represent communities of color and marginalized communities really have to understand what's going on with white people in a way that perhaps isn't really as sexy in terms of understanding the electorate. But I think that Trump has kind of proven that you can have, I wouldn't say he's a true populist in any sense, but he has tapped into a vein of something that he continues to mine fairly successfully. Were it not for the events of the last few months of the pandemic, I mean, I think we would have been looking at a pretty different electoral outcome.
Yeah. Jeet, let me come to you. Jeet, here for a look at the labor vote. Union households, as usual, voted majority Democratic. I think Joe Biden, according to the Edison polls, got like 56% of union household votes. But Donald Trump seems to have gotten 40% of them. And of voters who said that the economy was the most important issue, a shocking 83% seem to have gone Trump's way. Again, without forgetting who seems to actually have won this election, and let's just say has won this election. What do you make of the continuing appeal of Trump, even in union, which is to say households that historically have been fairly politically educated, fairly politically engaged, and more reliable perhaps than other white voters to vote Democratic?
Yeah, well, it depends on which unions as well. Like I think, in Nevada, the sort of, Latino union workers, went, thanks in large part to the Sanders campaign, went stuck with the Democrats. But I think it really depends on the campaign. And I think we haven't talked about the campaign. Biden campaigned on the unfitness of Donald Trump. And Trump campaigned on saying, well, I did good things for the economy. And okay, so the structural fact is that under Obama, the Federal Reserve did not push for full employment. They were worried about inflation, which is an insane worry. And they really did not go on easy money. And they only changed that after a lot of criticism coming from the left, started to change 2015, 2016. And Trump has really benefited from the Federal Reserve really pushing for full employment in a way that they haven't. And also he's benefited from the CARES Act, which was really helped a lot of people through this recession. So Trump was able to talk about the economy in a way that Joe Biden did not.
Well, let me just ask you for more on that, Jeet, because I'm talking to you from a sort of rural area, not a sort of rural, one of the 6 most rural districts in America, upstate New York, just 100 miles from Wall Street, but barely undercovered in our mainstream media. We've got a local factory here with, I think, 100 cases of COVID right now. And yet a debate around closing the economy versus opening it that really Trump won. So
Yes.
Can we talk to that question? There was very little attention to people like those living around me who felt that only a Trump vote stood between them and bankruptcy or poverty or homelessness, even if the price they paid was getting sick.
Yeah, well, I think that the reason that they lost the COVID debate was that it was all about expertise. And this is the Democrats pitching themselves as a party for the suburban college-educated voters, will trust Dr. Fauci, will trust expertise. When in this crisis, what you need to do is offer people an alternative, offer them enough money so they can get through this, and then and say that we'll make the sacrifice for COVID, but we'll take care of you. That was something that Biden did not offer. And I'm here in Canada, and I have to say, the Liberal Party of Canada, even though it's a centrist Liberal Party, did a much better job of ensuring working class people that they would be taken care of. And that's something the Democrats did not say, and they suffered for that.
Harold, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think one of the questionable calls the Democrats made was Nancy Pelosi being unwilling to reach a deal with Republicans on a second tranche of COVID aid. But I want to also point out that union members don't necessarily view their union membership as their defining attribute. It may be their race if they feel that that's the more salient issue. And what I think we have to realize here, and there are some polls of individual states that suggest the union vote was not even in the Democrats' favor. The AP North survey shows Trump carrying the union vote in Pennsylvania. I think we have to be cognizant that you may be a union member, but you may feel also that the dominance of the white race or the dominance of men or what have you is somehow threatened by the Democrats. And in terms of the minority vote, keep in mind that there's a big gender gap across all racial categories. So it's not a one-factor election as to whether the unions did good or did not. That may not be the most salient concern of a lot of voters.
Well, Michelle,
I
coming to
think the
you, I mean,
union-
the union piece of it used to be, I think, not that you were in the household, that you stepped across the threshold, or that was a membership card by somebody owned by somebody in the family, but that you experienced some level of political education, and
Yeah.
sometimes through labor-owned media. I mean, we're very excited to have this show. There's wonderful podcasts that are out there. Your podcast, Michelle, Belabored, does extraordinary educational work. But what role do you think, or what kind of a job do you think our traditional labor movement is doing these days on that political education piece that we can't rely on the rest of the media to do, that's for sure. And yet labor groups do pay an awful lot of money to traditional media during campaigns,
Right.
money that they spend the rest of the time just hating on them with.
And put a lot of energy into endorsing centrist candidates that end up absorbing the bulk of the political energy that they are able to generate, right? So I think that I mean, I think the category of union voter, and I say this as, someone who cares a lot about the labor movement, I think the category of union voter is increasingly pretty useless, not just because unions as a part of the workforce, the union represented sector of the workforce is shrinking continually, but because you have to look at, what sector do they work in? What are the demographics of the workforce? I mean, the face of the labor movement in terms of the fastest growing parts of it now are, women of color, right? So I think our stereotypes of the traditional union household, right? Someone who comes home in like a hard hat and overalls or whatever is fast becoming detached from reality. But I also think that unions do not do a very good job of fostering any sort of political cohesion or sense of civic engagement among their members, right? And their members increasingly see them as nothing more than just basically like, another group lobbying in Washington, or another group that Democrats go to every 4 years or every 2 years for an endorsement, right? I know a number of unions. I know a number of locals in which union members were supporting Bernie Sanders earlier on in the Democratic primaries, and they were upset, right? Or at least just incredibly disappointed to see, the union leadership going the other way. So I guess unions, I think maybe, one of the biggest symbols of how sort of irrelevant unions have become as a grassroots political force was in the Black Lives Matter protests that were roiling the country, and the AFL-CIO. I mean, the biggest statement that they made came after somebody set their headquarters on fire during the middle of the protest. I mean, not really labor's finest hour in terms of becoming a relevant force in
Thanks, Michelle. If people want to find out more about the backstory on that, I urge them to check out our last episode, or maybe it was 2 episodes ago, of City Works, where we talked about exactly that. We're going to take a quick break for some public service announcing. And I do encourage you, if you're viewing this in our live broadcast, to use the Zoom Q&A to post your questions. You're watching City Works. We'll be right back. So that having been a break, I'm now going to pick back up where we started. And I think I'm going to shift now to where do we go next, or how do we pick up from here, wherever we think we are, as this election remains still a little bit more undecided than we might like. How do we act, and how do we organize, particularly as people who care about workers, working people, and people who might like in the future either to work more or to work less? I had a chance to speak for my own program with Mary Kay Henry, the president of the SEIU, and she had this to say about the normality that we were promised. She doesn't actually want us to go back there. Here's Mary Kay.
Yeah, I have to tell you, again, we refuse to return to thinking about the past as a measure for what we should expect in the present. And because the depth of the crisis is so beyond anything anybody's ever experienced, and we've just seen huge shifts happen in the last 8 months. $3 trillion was released from the federal government in a 6-month period and went mostly to corporations and the wealthy. We have to be as bold and transformative in how we tackle the crisis for everybody in this nation. And so we intend to stay in the streets, to double down on organizing of non-union workers, of uniting our fights across movement, and expecting federal and state government to do bold transformational change in all aspects of our lives. And our unique contribution is going to be to make home care jobs the foundation of the next most inclusive, most racially diverse middle class that this nation has ever seen. And the women and primarily immigrant workers that got written out of the law in the 30s because Black legislators in the South didn't want workers who were primarily Black covered by labor law, they're going to get written in this time. And we're not stopping until the 64 million people in the service and care sector who are living in poverty and working 100 hours a week get a job that they can do one of, raise their family on, and lead a decent life.
So my obvious follow-up question to her on my program, and you can check it out at lauraflanders.org or on PBS stations or on YouTube, was how do you do that when you didn't have the big blue tsunami that many people were expecting, either in the Senate or the House? Lost about half a dozen House seats, retained a majority, but it's smaller. And looks like the Republicans will probably retain their edge in the Senate, although we don't know. 2 Senate seats are up for deciding in January. So Jeet, to you on that, how do we go from here to the next place?
Well, I think the first thing we have to recognize is that there was an anti-Trump majority and a strong majority. It's very rare to unseat a sitting president, but that the Democrats as a party failed. And I think that they failed because they just ran on anti-Trump and they kind of splintered their own coalition. If you remember the Democratic convention, it was this, I call it the second Republican convention, because they had John Kasich and they had a lot of Republicans. And so that strategy of trying to appeal to Republicans to defeat Trump, it achieved its goal, but it weakened the Democratic Party. So the next goal is the Democrats have to run not just against Trump, but they have to run against Republicans. And you need outside forces to force them to do that. You need this sort of cold, I think Joe Biden was really saved by activists in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, who really got out the vote in a way that he himself was not able to do, and Hillary Clinton wasn't. So we have to really take those activist forces and get them to work against the Democratic Party to force them to become a more progressive party.
All those places that you mentioned, and of course, Nevada and Arizona. I mean, Juan, coming to you, there's the Democratic Party organizing, and then there's the movement organizing that we always look to elections to either hurt or help. But when we're talking about a labor, working class, multiracial, diverse, cross-sectoral coalition of the sort that Mary Kay Henry would love to be creating, where are we and where does it go in this context?
Laura, we're just seeing how the Democrats, right after the election, are throwing all those groups under the bus. They needed all those progressive groups and labor groups and immigrant communities and working communities to really unite so they could help Joe Biden get to the White House. Right after the election results, the Democrats win, but never underestimate the ability that Democrats have to self-sabotage, right? So they don't even need the Republicans to attack them. Democrats are attacking Democrats right now. They are questioning whether they went too far with slogans, with Medicare for all, with immigration reform, with defund the police. While Democrats are fighting with each other, right now you have a Republican Party that is standing behind a president that is denying reality, denying the results of the election, and undermining every single fundamental institution of American democracy. And Republicans are telling reporters on background, listen, we know that Joe Biden won, don't worry, we're just walking the president through his feelings, and sooner or later, he'll admit that he lost the election. Well, while they are doing that, Republicans are taking advantage of this moment of creating an alternative universe, delegitimizing the results of the election, creating that truth, that alternative truth, that these results are not legitimate. And they're going to use that narrative for the next 4 years of divided government. Like you said, Laura's Republicans most likely will keep control of the Senate. They're going to use this narrative to boycott any single left-wing or center-left measure that Joe Biden is going to try to put forward.
So is that what we have to look forward to, Harold? I mean, I know that you've heard this very critique before. I feel like we've had this discussion every election. But in this case, a chill just went up my spine as I thought of what Juan Manuel was saying. We could start having journalists referring to people who are not believers in the results of the last election in the way that we have people who are not believers in climate change or not believers in evolution. We can't normalize this constituency, can we?
No, we absolutely cannot. And there's really, I mean, the only precedent I can think of, which was not a denial of reality, but a secession from reality, was, of course, the South secession after Lincoln was elected in 1860. I think a lot of what we may have to focus on is getting blue states and blue cities to push the envelope. And, the conflicts within the Democratic Party will also play out on that level. In California, in New York, there's considerable difference between the progressive Democrats and the centrist Democrats, though the Democrats in aggregate are in control. And so I think some of the movement's focus, even if we win Georgia, because there's still, a limit to what the Democrats could do with 50 votes plus Kamala Harris in the Senate, is going to have to be at the state level. And, in a sense, pushing the states to be more progressive widens this division in the United States. But we have to, demonstrate that our ideas work. And if we can only demonstrate that on the state level, let's go for it.
The states, too, though, didn't emerge from this as strongly as they would have if we'd seen Democratic investment in local legislative struggles, investment
Right.
of the sort that they put into, I don't know, the Lincoln Project or something. We saw Democrats lose chambers this time around, I believe. Is any lesson going to be brought?
They didn't pick up any legislatures except, ironically, in Arizona, which does redistricting by a nonpartisan commission anyway. So go figure.
But also, I mean, in Arizona,
Yeah,
you
Michelle.
also saw a huge grassroots push that was emanating from the wave of teachers' strikes earlier. So I also think that's another example of how state action can really be energized by really good ground game that is often detached from the agenda of the candidate that they're pushing for.
So we're coming towards the end of our time, and we have to end, I think, where we began, which was on the question of race and racism and how it operates in America. We like to talk about demographic groups and race as a kind of static thing, but I think we need to be grappling with the way racism functions in our elections and where maybe neoliberalism, the class critique, the labor critique fails to function. Or maybe you could flip it around and tell me, did you see examples of a kind of solidarity being created across racial lines, across lines of racist ideology and demagoguery that would be helpful going forward? Because we're looking at a pandemic, a recession, and an administration, the Joe Biden part of which has, thinks he knows how to deal with a crisis like this one, because he was here in 2008 and 9, and we remember what didn't happen then. Jeet, to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there are sort of very positive stories in terms of Georgia, particularly, that is offering a kind of model for where you can mobilize, in a state that has historically been, had a terrible history of racism, really mobilize African-American voters, but also bring in white voters to the Democratic coalition. So I think that precisely happened because you had a strong state party. And I think there's nothing to stop that from happening in a place like Florida, except that many of the state parties are sclerotic, they're very dysfunctional or corrupt. And I think that's where the progress is going to have to come from.
Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of local races that were definitely inspiring. I mean, we see groups like the DSA, of which I am a member, having a lot of local victories. Yes, on the state legislatures in New York, even, which has at least historically had one of the most corrupt state legislatures in the country, probably. And so I think 2016 energized people to really look harder at local races and not fixate on the presidency so much. And my fear going forward is that now that Democrats are in control of the White House, at least as far as we know,
maybe,
that it will lead to another sort of wave of complacency in which Democrats feel that they can take the constituencies that put them in office for granted, and in another 4 years, who knows what will happen? Who knows what right-wing demagogue will be put forward? And in terms of minority turnout, I think Georgia is a great example. But I also think that there were people who got elected on the local level who were movement people, right? I mean, they came out of grassroots struggles and they came out of street movements, and so And so I think that that's an area that we actually need to tap into, and that's why it's so discouraging to see some centrist Democrats sort of circling the wagons right now and poo-pooing people for using words like socialism. So.
Harold, to you, about a minute, and then last word to Juan Manuel for this part of the discussion.
I think we can't dismiss the fact that ever since Bernie Sanders announced his candidacy in 2015, the American left has really become revitalized. It's larger. It's a substantial group within the Democratic Party, and it's not going away. So I mean, there is a massive shift in what Democrats believe over the last 5 years, and it's something that we should take pride in. And I don't think it's going away. And I think that's going to be something of a break on Democratic centrists. We'll just have to see.
Juan Manuel?
I believe that the Democrats are extremely good at symbolism, but then when it comes to pragmatism, Republicans are way better, right? So Democrats got a symbolic victory with Kamala Harris, right? She is the first woman, the first woman of color, all those things that are amazingly great for the history of this country. But now when it comes to what are you gonna do for Black women now? What are you gonna do for working women? What are you gonna do for Latino women? So are those policies catering to those demographic groups that are part of your base, the Democratic Party? Are those policies too radical for the alternative universe that Republicans and conservatives are creating, where truth doesn't really matter and facts don't really matter? So Democrats are going to be they're going to have to be extremely pragmatic, like you said. Legislatures in Republican hands in many states all over the country. They're going to get to do the redistricting. So Republicans are going to be extremely focused on how do we retake the House and how do we redraw districts so we have an advantage. So hopefully, so we have a better balance of power. Democrats are going to be paying attention to those things the same way that they pay attention to symbolic feats for the history of this country.
I want to thank you very much, everybody, for participating in today's roundtable. We have many more topics yet to discuss. I hope in future episodes of CityWorks, we can talk a little bit about what happened in California with ballot initiative 22, the future of precarious and gig workers in the next administration, and maybe draw a little solace from some of the other ballot initiatives that got passed this election. We didn't get a chance to talk about them this time, but we will next, I promise. So thank you, Michelle Chen, Jeet here, Harold Meyerson, Juan Manuel Benitez. Thank you for sharing your insights and your knowledge in this crazy time of transition. It is good to know, while so much is uncertain, that we can count on you. I urge viewers to support our guest publications, magazines, podcasts, programs like this one. Unbowed, unbought, unbeholden to big pharma or any other media monopoly, independent media is going to be more critical than ever in these times. So thank you for watching CityWorks. CityWorks is a co-production of the School of Labor and Urban Studies at the City University of New York and CUNY TV. If you have questions or comments, you can reach us at cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. For CityWorks, I'm Laura Flanders. And don't go away, because we are now going to go to the live Q&A portion of our conversation with our audience questions. I just had to squeeze in that one about the ballot initiatives, because I think it was a mixed and maybe slightly cheering story that we got from those. Several increasing the minimum wage, some coming down on super high earners. The big defeat, of course, in California of ballot measure or initiative 22 measure, I think, 22, that would have changed the definition of Lyft and Uber workers from the current contractor status to actual employees deserving of benefits. Anything you want to add to that discussion about what's happening on the ballot level that we didn't get to? And then I'll look at our questions from the audience. Harold.
As a 50-year resident of California before I descended into Washington, D.C., You know, the victory of Uber and Lyft and DoorDash, who put collectively over $200 million into their campaign. I mean, historically in California, if anyone totally outspends the opposition, they win. I mean, the irony, and it's a big irony, is that the initiative process was devised in 1911 by progressives in the legislature to overcome the dominance that big money interests at that point, like this Southern Pacific Railroad, had over lawmaking. Now, big money actually dominates that process they set up to avoid that. So I mean, that's a hard reality. It's also a hard reality that the measure which progressives have been planning for decades in California to undo Proposition 13 by reassessing big business properties at their current value, not their 1978 value, narrowly appears to have lost. I think in some ways the pandemic helped undo that because it made the supporters of keeping it as is determined to say that this will screw all these businesses, which may be folding anyway. The other big initiative that is a success from my point of view was raising the minimum wage to $15 in Florida, which needed 60% of the vote to pass, and it got 61% of the vote. And that has to mean, given the way Florida voted on the presidency, that a good chunk of Republicans voted for that too. And that's something that we progressives should keep in mind. Almost any time a minimum wage hike is put before voters, they approve it.
We got a question in the chat about trade policies, and that's another topic we didn't get to in our earlier discussion. Jeet, coming to you, the question is, do you believe the Biden-Harris message addressed the trade policies that failed Clinton in 2016? Many white unionized voters never forget NAFTA, TPP. I'm not sure that TPP is unrevivable. It may be revived, right? Jeet.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at what Biden is saying about China, it does seem like that's what his kind of plan is, and he's going to try to revive it under the auspices of national security, that we have to contain China and that this trade agreement will help us build the alliances. And I think that is one of the factors that must have contributed to, you know, like the weaker showing than in terms of trade issues. And Trump, if you look at I mean, there's a lot of things Trump did wrong, but in terms of campaigning in the last few weeks, like he really hammered home the issue of trade, and he really went to, you know, these Rust Belt states, and he really said that, you know, Biden is a candidate of NAFTA, and he's so I think that in a lot of ways that's something that continues to haunt the Democratic Party, especially if they nominate people that have historically held these positions.
Yeah, I mean, he did all those. Yeah, Michelle, come in.
I was going to say the two parties, I think, are more or less indistinguishable on trade in Washington over the past couple of generations, probably, at least going back to NAFTA, which was, of course, passed under the Clinton administration. But yeah, I do think that in terms of controlling the narrative, I was actually surprised that trade and the sort of, you know, blue collar, hard hat fetishism thing didn't play into the last few months of this campaign as much as it did in 2016. And I think that suggests perhaps that Trump maybe tends to milk that when he feels like there aren't other, when he's not dealing with a global pandemic and other issues that kind of came to the fore. But I do wish that Biden, instead of just, you know, standing in Pennsylvania and proclaiming that he's from Scranton, had actually done more to actually address some of the material concerns of people who have been really hard done by. I do think that trade is going to become increasingly a concern, not just because of the way Trump has sort of, you know, unilaterally at least tried to portray himself as an isolationist and done a lot of things to sort of alienate the global rules-based order or whatever it's called. But I also think that there really needs to be a new vision for what globalization and trade should mean from a progressive standpoint. And it can't be a choice between, you know, just completely, taking a completely sort of neoliberal pandering stance and just doing another free trade deal that'll just benefit corporations and just completely withdrawing from trade. And I don't think that the normal divide between Democrats and Republicans and trade versus protectionism really plays out anymore, because one, these trade deals are incredibly complex and most people don't quite understand what they're about until their job is gone, right? And two, because the Chamber of Commerce has really long talons that stretch deep into the upper echelons of both parties. And I think that when it comes to trade, ordinary people are definitely completely alienated from the process of coming up with these deals. And so I think that there just needs to be a whole lot of civic education and a lot more grassroots mobilization around what the global economy should look like. And I think that with the climate emergency sort of looming over everything, I think that we really need to look at just how consumption and production and all of the consequences of that under a free market capitalist system need to be controlled, and how the benefits of that, to the extent that there are, need to be distributed in a much more just and fair way.
I don't see a question specifically on climate up there, but Harold, I did want to ask you, another aspect of, I think, where Trump was able to find some foothold was in the failure of the Democratic message to connect a Green New Deal with great new jobs. And instead, you saw kind of a liberal response to the shutdown being, yay, emissions are down. When people were really hurting and are really hurting, and they are hurting more now, right as we seem to have no policy center at all. So, Harold.
Absolutely. I think anyone who said yay should be, disbarred or whatever we can do to them. Yes, certainly the Democrats needed to make a better case on infrastructure equal Green New Deal, equal infrastructure, et cetera. I mean, rebuilding the country, which I think everyone acknowledges we need, pave the damn roads, elected the Democrat as governor of Michigan. Rebuilding the country requires doing it on a green level, and the Democrats need to do better than that. I do want to point out, though, in response to the previous question on trade, that the Chamber of Commerce does reach the upper echelons of the Democratic Party. It doesn't reach the lower echelons. In the House, a majority of Democrats voted against NAFTA, against PNTR with China. It's at the Senate level and the presidential level where the party becomes the adjunct of Wall Street. And this has divided the Democratic Party for decades now. And it's going to continue to be a division. And we just need to keep mobilizing on the side of not forfeiting our economy to the globalist dreams of Wall Street.
Laura,
Juan,
I think it's going to be really important when it comes to messaging. Are the Democrats going to be able to really communicate Americans what they really want to do and why they really want to do it, right? The Green New Deal, that for many people might be a really good idea that might bring a lot of new jobs, it's a long-term strategy, right? That it's really easy to attack when it comes to the short term. How are Democrats, how is a Biden presidency going to deal with the recovery after this crisis we're going through right now because of the pandemic? And how is going to be the job creation aspect of it, right? Right now, many workers in this country are extremely happy with the economy that Donald Trump had for the first 3.5 years of his presidency. So how are Democrats going to tell those workers, listen, it might take a little longer, or we might have to use a different strategy for the economy to work in the long term? How is that message going to be conveyed when the Republicans' attacks are going to be nonstop? They're not going to have any kind of truce here, right? So explaining workers why the Green New Deal or similar strategies are important is going to be a large part of the job. And the best example was the Obama presidency. And President Obama used to complain a lot about, listen, we're doing a lot of great things, maybe we're not communicating them well. So Democrats need to get better at that, because Republicans are not gonna give them a break.
We haven't talked about age demographics in our discussion about demographics, and I don't see a question about this either, but I'm going to make one up, which has to do with, there is not, apart from, I think, African-American women, there isn't a firmer demographic for the Democrat this time than young voters under, I think, 29. What needs to be done for them, as they too are workers or want to be workers? Many of them overloaded already with debt. Quick take from you, Jeet, Michelle, Juan, who wants to take that? Jeet.
Well, that's actually, Joe Biden was not the preferred candidate of young people, but they did come out for him because they don't like Trump. But I think there's actually stuff that he can do even with a Republican Senate, which is, like on day one, he can sign an executive order to end a lot of debt. And I think that would make a big difference for an entire generation of young, and not even so much young. There are people in their 30s and 40s that have that are overloaded with student debt. So I think it's perfectly justifiable, and I think that'd be a great way to kind of cement, to really reward this group for helping save American democracy.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to come in? Michelle?
I was just thinking about, it's hard to imagine that at the beginning of the year, when Bernie was looking like he might actually win the Democratic primary, the conversation around what we envisioned for the next 4 years would have looked so different, right? I mean, we started talking about how, Green New Deal, free college, like that was a thing, before the pandemic hit. And I feel like, when we sort of get out of the fog of the current crisis, we'll be able to think more clearly about what this country owes to its young people, and how they're going to be dealing with the consequences of much older lawmakers in our more or less gerontocracy right now, for generations to come, right? And I also think that I think that the youth vote, I think young people of color were sort of, came out in numbers because they knew that unless they showed up to the polls, that their stake in society was not going to be recognized by the people making the laws. And I'm just thinking about, the DACA activists, who can't vote, right? I mean, they're spending they're putting their days and their time and energy into mobilizing people who could vote on their behalf. And I think that there needs to be a much broader sense of what it means to build a civically engaged populace of young people that goes beyond how many just turn up at the polls, because everyone likes to sort of talk about how, young people are so apathetic, they don't turn out to the polls. I mean, I think more than anything, it shows how we continually fail to give them a reason to show up.
Yeah, the data that I've seen, and I can't confirm it at this moment, but I think that I saw that Democratic Party new registrations were kind of in the doldrums until the Black Lives Matter protests took off. And at that moment, with the killing of George Floyd, you saw the real increase in any kind of new registration drive. Harold, there is a question on the chat about what are the chances for progress on racial justice, abolition, decarceration, particularly in the context of a DC that is already blaming its own voters for their radical dreams and visions.
Well, at the national level, even if the Democrats win the Georgia seats, I don't foresee much progress. I think this has to go on, like many things will have to go on at the state level, where there has been some progress. And one of the most impressive things about Black Lives Matter in Los Angeles, they had an electoral strategy that was brilliant in addition to the street strategy, which a lot of movements never do. They ousted a DA and got a progressive district attorney in there. And this is in a county with 10 million people. They defeated a ballot measure that would have increased incarceration rates on people. They did a damn good job. We have not heard the last. I think we've only heard the first from Black Lives Matter.
And Laura, I think it's going to be extremely important that the Democrats don't take these groups, these demographics for granted. they're going to need them energized in 2 years. If they really want any big policy achievements in Biden presidency, Medicare for all, free college, Green New Deal, any climate legislation, they're going to need a Democratic Senate. And they will have another chance in 2 years, right? And they need to keep the House majority. So how do you keep all these, the whole coalition that gave you a Biden presidency, how do you keep them energized and united so they can give you a little more in 2 years, you can really do something politically? Otherwise, we're going to be fighting for the next 4 years about whether the election results from 2020 were legitimate or not. And we can we might see President Biden who cannot even nominate a Supreme Court justice because the Senate majority is going to tell him, we don't know if you deserve a pick because we're not sure you won the election. That's going to happen.
Jeet, do you want to cheer me up after that last comment?
No, I think the most cheering thing is that we have seen mass movements. The biggest protest in American history took place this year, and that they are, as Harold mentioned, at a local level, they're doing amazing things to get, and the movement continues. The two big hurdles are the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and these movements are going to have to try to ride herd on both of them and push both of them. That's the hope.
All right. Well, I think you cheered me up at least a little. Oh, Michelle, did you want to?
No, I was just going to say, I might get in trouble for saying this, but I think the 4 years of Trump were actually good for social movements. And I fear that the next 4 years may not be so good for social movements. So I think we need to keep up the momentum.
Except that Black Lives Matter started under Obama.
That's true. Yeah, for sure.
True.
But in terms of just everything cresting in this last year before the election was something.
All right. Well, with that, I will close this discussion. I thank you all and remind viewers and listeners that you can get more information at slu.cuny.edu/events. That's slu.cuny.edu/events. There are a lot of great ones coming up, courtesy of the School of Labor and Urban Studies at the City University of New York. Harold, Michelle, Jeet, Juan, Manuel, thank you so much. I really appreciate you helping me to stay sane today, or something close to it.
Thanks. I was not sure.
Keep up your great work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.